Welcome to the Dayna Danger Art Gallery for the opening today and curator's tour of Sovereign 2. My name's Robin Simpson. I'm the coordinator of public programs and education here at the gallery. So we're going to start in advance of the vernissage proper with a tour with Wanda Nanibush, who is our guest here. And Wanda's curator of Canadian Indigenous, assistant curator of Indigenous and Canadian art at the Archive of Ontario. And just before we get going, a quick but important acknowledgement that the gallery, all our events here and the university are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. And we thank them for their hospitality. So I'll pass the microphone on to you.
Here. Anine, hello. Bonjour. I'm Wanda Nanibush. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see so many people here. We'll have to get intimate when we go into some of the smaller spaces for the tour, so you just have to hug up to each other. I'm Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation, which is an island in Georgian Bay. And I'm Mayengan clan, which is Wolf Clan. I spend most of my time working with art and politics, so you'll see a lot of that in the show. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank the gallery and Michelle for having me here. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank the Kanien'kehá:ka for having us here on their territory. And the translation of the show is there on the wall. And anyone who knows what the root words of the word curator in Mohawk, please tell me, because I want to know. I want to sort of dissect the word. So I do a lot of translating of shows now. My show in Toronto at the Art Gallery of Ontario is also translated into the language of that land, which is Anishinaabe. And that's kind of important to me because we're creating new words in the language every time we do that. And we're kind of creating bridges between our knowledge and the knowledge of the art spaces that we work in. Not to mention evoking our ancestors every time we are in these spaces. So that's why it's very important that that's there. I'll start. There is this. This is not what I'm going to talk about, but you can read this on your own free time. I want to talk a bit about each work and where the kind of inspiration for the show came from. And we're going to start over here because this is where I began. So this is a work by Rebecca Belmore, and the, are you good? I have to be slow so the camera can kind of catch up. So this is a work in a wilderness garden by Rebecca Belmore, and as you'll notice, there's two different media here. We've got your 1997 media and your 2012 media in the center. So I saw her give this lecture, a performative lecture in Vancouver where she showed these two videos on the ends. And in these videos, it's shot in Banff in the national park. And she had been reading in a friend's house about this Mi'kmaq guy, probably from the early 1600s. The history is spotty, and she can't remember the book, which is okay, because it doesn't matter in this situation. So basically, she was the guy had been captured and taken to Europe to perform in a wealthy person's garden. And in that garden, he was to shoot a deer, kill the deer, eat the deer. But then performance art was born when he shat after eating the deer. And for Rebecca, she was talking about that as the first moment of Indigenous performance art. And so it started making me think about different histories of performance and where we can think about the birth of performance. So it's not just that he was performing his culture in front of somebody else. He actually subverted the kind of Victorian morals of the time by following the system all the way through to the excavation of his body. And you can imagine the Victorian morals and how that would be taken at a dinner party. And this is kind of one of the roles of performance art, I think, is to assert the body and also to intervene and sometimes to upset you. So in this piece, on this side, you have Rebecca as the captive. And she was also thinking about parks as a form of captivity of nature, of animals, of land. And so thinking about the deer or the elk and how they roam through territories that are all demarcated after colonization. So even their pathways are sort of broken. So they can't do their regular migrations. So there's also a connection to that. And then she created the centerpiece. So we got to a conversation and we thought about doing an installation of this work. And she created this centerpiece. So the back, you can't even enter this person's image. You can't enter anything, even their body. It's all denied to you. So there's another form of resistance going on in the middle panel compared to the other two. And also, again, you have this sort of colonial, the colonial creation of cleanliness through the hedge, through the leaf blower, the way in which we sort of try to keep everything messy away, at bay. So that's one of the central tenets of colonization. Okay, so that's this piece. So I started thinking about all these early performers and who they were and what were they doing and why were they doing it. Some were captured, but if we look to the early 18th century, 1800s, you start to see us choosing to do cultural performances, us traveling to Europe to perform on stages, the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, these kinds of things. So, and when you look at what we were performing, and let's go look at one right now. So this was shot in 1894, and it's the first film with dance, with indigenous dance on it, but dance in general. And it was shot in Edison's studio. So at the birth of this kind of technology, and what I think is the birth of modernism, there is us performing culture on a stage of sorts. So these guys, these are Sioux guys, and related to the Standing Rock folks right now. And they were traveling around with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And they were performing a so-called ghost dance at the time. And this is called ghost dance, but this is not a ghost dance. So you can see the kind of emotions that they're doing are very stereotypical of what we would imagine and what has been imagined for hundreds of years as the native dancing, with the legs up and it's kind of graceless. And so it's interesting because these guys, when I did research on who they were actually at Wounded Knee, which is a huge massacre. And they were resisting, and it was a huge massacre, and they were resisting with the ghost dance. The ghost dance is a dance of resistance. So when our cultural dances were, and I say dances, but dance means governance systems, it means ceremony, it means politics, spirituality, it means all those things. It's not just a dance. So it was building, it was a resistance that was building, and the government got really afraid of it. And people had gathered at Wounded Knee, and there was, and you should read this history, because it's happened again in the 1970s. So these guys were arrested there in that resistance and thrown in jail. So then Buffalo Bill went around looking for performers, and what better performers than those who were already imprisoned. So he lobbied the government, and the government at first had to contemplate it, because at this point the ghost dance was banned. So was the sun dance, which is also tied to resistance. These are the two ceremonies that were the most reviled by the governments of both the US and Canada, Britain, all these people. So these guys chose to go with Buffalo Bill rather than rot in jail. They traveled the world. They went to Europe. They went all over North America. And they knew what they were doing. They knew they were performing some kind of colonial imaginary, but they were using that as an opportunity to gain and bring back knowledge to their communities of the world. They had freedom, real basic thing. And they also, because they're gathered together, they can practice their ceremonies, they can practice their culture in this way and with each other in private. So it's a major moment of resistance. So even though this document could be read as a racist document, I read it as a sign of resistance. So the other, go back over there. Okay, so this is James Luna, and in the center here is Ishi, who is another point in this history. So he was sold as a primitive man, and he lived in an anthropology museum, and he was thought of the last of his kind. So he really fulfilled this idea that indigenous people were disappearing off into the sunset like they should. And this is the cover of a book, and he chose this specifically. And what he's doing is inhabiting Ishi. So it's a reiteration of the photograph from the contemporary moment. But what has happened in the space in between, one, I mean, he's saying we're still here, so nobody disappeared. Two, he's doing the same face in a kind of parody, which dislodges the factualness of the photograph. It makes you sort of think about whether this is the portrait of Ishi is real or not, or is this the portrait of Ishi of our imagination, of a racist imagination, a colonial imagination. But also, because he is an ancestor of sorts, we always have to ask another question. So it's not just dislodging stereotypes. He's saying, okay, so if we did ask, what did Ishi feel? What did he think? Why don't we know what he said? Why don't we know what he felt? Where did his voice go? So you start to ask these kinds of questions, and I think Indigenous artists are much more primed to do that. There's a lot of critique of stereotypes, but nobody's asking these kinds of questions. So that's partly what's happening in here. And also, I mean, he's also saying fuck you to the image in the first place, right? And to the imaginary that gave birth to it. So there's also that kind of energy that I love so much. My mom always said I walked out of her womb saying fuck you. It's like, I didn't slide out, I walked out. So I'm really drawn to work like that. So we'll come here to Lori Blondo. So this work, this is a new work by Lori, just created in the last year. And I guess I should preface too. So Sovereign Acts 1, this is Sovereign Acts 2. Sovereign Acts 1 was done in 2012 as part of a master's program I was in at the University of Toronto, which showed at the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery. And so when we brought it here, I mean, a lot of years have passed, and you continue to think on things, and you continue to be inspired by things, and your thinking on something may get deeper. So we decided to add more work and to choose different work from the artists. And I went back to the artists and I said, would you like to submit something new, something different? You know, because they had engaged the show because it toured. So they knew the thematics very well. And so Lori really wanted to show this new work. And thinking in the context of murdered and missing Indigenous women and the history that underlies that, the view of Indigenous women as princesses or squaws in the history, colonial history that goes way back to the 1500s. It actually goes back much further than that into Europe before anyone ever set foot on this continent. The history is so long. And the problem with with that is it doesn't even matter that people know that. The reiteration of those stereotypes over and over and over again create an environment of violence for Indigenous women. And not only create an environment of violence, but also create the environment for it to be okay. So it's unpunishable violence. And we've seen that. I'm in Quebec. We can look at Val d'Or, right? And the lack of punishment of police. So I'm going to get emotional when I talk about this. So this work sort of sidesteps that a little bit, and it says, like, women standing in their strength, in who they are. So instead of just being a headline of a murdered missing women, and if I hear that hashtag MMIW one more time, I'm going to scream, because even though we're trying to raise awareness, you end up eclipsing the subjectivity of women again, because then we just become murdered and missing Indigenous women. So in this work, she's standing on all these rocks, which are very important specific places for Indigenous people. They're spiritual places, they're places of power. So she's drawing that power from the land, from the ground, from that spot into her body. And you can see the power as it surges through her. Thinking about other sort of histories of Indigenous women and our lineages to our grandmothers, our mothers, their strength, their power. And we just had one of the, largest resistances of Indigenous women in this country for a number of years, I don't know more, which I was like a huge part of. And it's still going. And there is this push for Indigenous women to sort of take their place, which is the place. If you're Mohawk, it would be, it's a matriarchy. For Anishinaabe like myself, it's a bit different. There is kind of a shared leadership between men and women, but in both cases, women are honored for their difference and for their power as women, as mothers, as caretakers, this kind of thing. And she's draped in red. We can talk about why. I think it's kind of obvious. And so we can go, I want to stay with this women line for a second. So she often inhabits personas, but here there is no persona. She's actually inhabiting almost like an icon for everyone. If we go into this room and stand by the Shelley Nero that's just on that wall there. So here's another avenue, and Laurie is influenced by Shelley, for sure, especially in this form of parody and humor in performative photography. And so here, the 500-Year Itch is obviously a play on a Marilyn Monroe film. But here she's showing this sort of construction of the image by placing a fan underneath between her legs, which is going to blow up her dress. And you can see the kind of the blonde wig doesn't quite look so at home, and the makeup. So this is Shelley as Marilyn Monroe. And then on this side, you have Shelley as herself, but in this kind of like almost dejected sort of stance and face. And then in the middle is this beautiful portrait of her mother. And so I was thinking about what comes along in a society that is sort of transplanted on top of you is also all these images and histories of beauty, of what is beauty, of how a woman should be. And a person has to negotiate these things, and that's what Shelley is doing, but not negotiating. She's asserting the beauty of her mother. She's asserting the beauty of the women in her family. She's asserting Indigenous beauty. And she's also taking the piss out of Marilyn Monroe's sort of, and this kind of constructed image. And people think it happened naturally, that photograph. It didn't. It was just as constructed, her over this grate, So in that sense. there is a dissonance that can happen inside oneself as one struggles to sort of find your place within within images of beauty that you could never be. And in the entire exhibition, at the point at which colonization happens, the kind of destructive and painful and violent genocide that takes place requires two things. One is the banishment of your own culture and the making of white. So there was no white before here, actually. So they actually have to create what white means because they have to give it to you. They have to say, okay, we want you to be white, so now we have to decide what that is. So it actually subjugates everybody. It subjugates all of us to this idea of what whiteness means. And I think that all of these artists are subverting this because you can neither be the perfect white, nor can you be this perfect Indian of the colonial imagination either. So you end up saying fuck off to all of it, and you end up creating something completely different that is negotiating all those things because you can see them, you can play with them, you can mess with them. And there's power in that. And the 500-year itch obviously is referring to 500 years of colonization. So at that time they were celebrating Columbus, and it was like, yay, colonization. So, and it's actually, it's really interesting to me right now because there is this 150 years celebration thing going on. And I feel like we haven't been as strong. Like at the 500-year mark, when that happened, there was such a huge push against it. And we renamed it 500 Years of Colonization. And we did all this stuff. So, sorry, I'm being a little mean right now, but I just feel like we haven't even renamed it. We're still calling it Canada 150. I just posted a little because there are some artists who have been working on calling it at least Colonial 150 or Colonization 150 or trying to shift the language around so that we can sort of really talk about what it is that we are celebrating. And that's also what this work is referring to. After 500 years, it'd be really itchy. So this is James Luna, and he wasn't in the original iteration of this exhibition, so I was really happy I could include him because he really gave birth to a lot of this style of work. He is like the first. And this is a new work by him called In My Room, obviously from the song that you're hearing. So what happens when culture is banished, or it does go underground and it gets saved, right? Because nothing ever disappears for real. But what also happens is that people who are dislocated from those cultural ceremonies, from those practices, it ends up also becoming stereotyped to a certain degree. And so people can be, in order to find legitimacy, to find a speaking voice as an Indigenous person in this country or in the States, sometimes you feel like you have to take up the stereotype of what these cultures, what these ceremonies are. And I think there's a real resistance in art that's present that says that that's not necessary at all. And so this is James doing his ceremony in his backyard. So he has a sweat in his backyard. It's very personal. It's very much, it's very real. It's very important. So he's sort of drawing attention to that these things are practiced, and they are personal, and they are important, and that there is a history of them outside of this sort of stereotype idea of authentic Indigenous culture. So we have an inauthentic fire with our logs and our things and our little glowing flame, and that's a real fire, but it's not really because it's an image. So he's really playing with these ideas, but also it's a really heartfelt piece for him. It's like how hard it is for his generation to pick up these ceremonies after it had been denigrated for so long. It's an effort, and it's a sense of personal power once one does that. but it doesn't negate the fact that it was really difficult to do. And so that's also a form of resistance. You'll notice that I'm not talking about ceremony as the artist doing ceremony, or as performance art as ritual. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the representation of ceremony and ritual in people's, and the practice of it in people's lives. So this is a portrait. These are portraits of shaman done by Robert Houle. This is also new work, 2015. So Shaman Never Die is the first one. Shaman Dream in Color is the middle one. Shaman Heals by Touching is this one. And this blue is his spirit color that's on the wall. So when the apology for residential schools happened, unfortunately, on my birthday in 2006, so my birthday will never be the same again. That's what I get to remember every year. I just get really drunk. No, just kidding. That's how to deal with trauma. So we got to talking in his house because he had started doing a series of drawings when he came back from the apology, because I was too angry to go. I couldn't go to the apology. I was not ready. And I also felt the apology would be false. And I've been proven right. So we were sitting there and he wanted to show me these drawings. So he was showing me, and in the drawings, he's remembering experiences of residential school that hadn't been part of his memory before. So the apology actually triggered memories that he thought he had dealt with his residential school experience, which, my mother went to residential school. I understand very well the sort of legacy of this. And you always sort of think you're done when you go through your healing path. You think you're done, and then something like an apology or something will happen that will trigger something, and then all of a sudden you're back in it again, or maybe you're remembering new things. So that's what happened to him. And after the process of all of that and reliving very horrific memories, he painted these. Once he had toured around the work and talked about it a lot, he sort of felt like he was done that part. And so he painted the shaman. And like I said with James, it's also for people who went through residential school to pick up your spiritual traditions has been part of the healing process and has been a really important part. And in his territory, those practices have never ended. So, their family has always been practicing. And you can understand this sort of relationship between art making and healing, art making and using art as a way to both exorcise these kinds of demons, but also invoke the shaman, invoke the moment when the healing has happened. But by placing them here, it also does that for others. And again, we always have to negotiate the sort of stereotypical colonial representation of our spirituality and all of that. Nonetheless, still try to practice and still try to do it in a way that makes sense to us. I was sitting in, I think it's, maybe I won't tell this on the camera. You can ask me later. So this is also another site for me thinking about what performance means in our context, and what is ceremonial practice, and what is the performative aspect of ceremony, and what does it do, and how does it help us think about who we are as a people? How does it help us think about what an individual is for us? All these kinds of things. So that's also why that stream is in this exhibition. It's another site of a history that is never told in this context. This is a work by Jeff Thomas, and it's actually his first photographs, 1980s. And what he was doing at the time was traveling around powwows, and powwow is like a modern form, a modern ceremonial space, a modern space of traditional teaching. And I mean that to say that it's something that has changed, transformed, and continued. But in these photographs, he always makes sure that there's like signs of modernity. You know, you got the truck, you have the shoes. Which ones are these? These are flights. I'm sure they were really cool at the time. You have the suitcase, so the traveling to a spot to perform this. You have, you know, the little mirror with Pink Panther on it. So you have these kinds of things to give the audience a clue, because if you just present it straight, people often think that nothing has changed, or that authenticity is still what it was at contact. So this is trying to say that culture changes and that's the authentic thing. But also, it's in this exhibition to highlight the role of powwow for a generation who were coming out of residential schools and when the banning against our culture ended. So it's also for me, because when I grew up, I was not interested in powwow. To me, it was like empty. It felt like, oh God, we gotta perform Indian for people. Like, I just didn't like it. And my mother loved it. And she was so moved by the sound of the drum. And so it was interesting for me to go through this process of understanding powwow beyond its representation, beyond what I see. So the deeper you go into it, the more you get to know. And so once you feel the power of that drum, then you can never ever be in that situation without feeling it. And it becomes something really important to you after a while. And the drum is the heartbeat of our Mother the Earth, and it connects us to all creation, all living. And so I think that those kinds of aspects are kind of missing when we talk about stereotypes and things like this. So every kind of stereotype on the surface could have some kind of deep thing for us underneath that gets robbed by its representation. Yeah. So this is Shelley Nero again. Abnormally Aboriginal. I just love her facial expressions. It's like Laurie can do power and like grace so well with her face and body. Shelley has this deadpan thing that she can do so brilliantly. So we've got abnormally Aboriginal, normal, original, and then just the DNA strand. So also trying to strip away all of the layers, the sedimentation of colonization, of negative views. The other piece we have that I won't be stopping at is Iroquois is a matriarchal, no, the title is Matriarchal Society. Oh, yeah? Yeah. That's okay. That's fine. So she's often asking the question of how are we matriarchal, how are we honoring the power of women today? And in that piece, she often uses her family or herself to sort of assert these women as beautiful, as powerful, as the matriarchs of today. And she's often will call people out when they say these things, but they're just words. So she'll call out if there's like a protest or something like that, and the men are behaving in a way to women that is not at all honoring them and their Mohawk men, she'll just be like, okay, so how are we a matriarchal society and how are you honoring that? So it's also to say that the view that we have of what that means will change for today, for now, for right now. It's not like picking something up from the past and plopping it down now as if it isn't changed. And she's not afraid of that change because she sees the women around her and how strong they are. I've been reading a lot about DNA too, so there's lots to be thinking about in terms of DNA. There was like this study done recently where they couldn't trace indigenous DNA to any people in the world, which means for that kind of diversity to happen and for you to be unable to trace it to anybody else, the people would have to be kind of isolated from everybody for over 120,000 years. And I think a lot about how much insecure settler societies are about their roots here and their place here, that they have to keep reasserting and asserting over and over again that we weren't here that long either. So we're immigrants too. And it's like, at what point can we stop asking those questions and start asking much more important questions? And Indigenous people just assert their understanding of the world anyway, regardless, because they're not concerned with the settlers' insecurity. It's not our concern. That's somebody else's concern. We don't have to be worried about that. We have to worry about passing on our stories to our kids. Okay. Let's go over here to, I don't know how much time, so I think I have to wrap it up soon. This is Laurie Blondeau and Adrian Stimson. And it's called Putting the Wild Back in the West. Like wild. And there's a series of these photographs. They've done it, it comes out of a performance. So Adrian comes out as Buffalo Boy, and you'll see more of Buffalo Boy around the corner here. And Laurie comes out as Belle Sauvage. So both of these characters are influenced by the Buffalo Bills, are playing on Buffalo Bill's Wild West show from the 1800s. And also, Belle Sauvage is influenced by like kind of gun women that were toting guns and women that were like in the rodeos, and also by her grandmother and their horse riding ways. And her grandmother was really good with trick horse. So she was really good with tricks and really good with horses. And so she's also asserting a sort of family lineage to this character. And she was the queen of the only queer rodeo in the world. This is part of the fiction of Belle Sauvage. And Adrian Stimson's character, or persona, Buffalo Boy, is also citing the slaughter of the buffalo. So in his career, he wants to create images, art of buffalo that equals the amount of buffalo that were killed by the time he's done. So he's creating tons of buffaloes in all different ways to mark that. And he equates the slaughter of the buffalo with the slaughter of his people. He's Blackfoot. And that's not just an imaginary connection, that's a real connection, because starvation, actual starvation. And all the practices that come with a figure like the buffalo. If you get rid of the buffalo, then you also get rid of all of those practices and that are associated with that, as well as the governance systems that are migrate around those, that come from those practices. So this is a fun piece, though, but it has this really serious history underneath, where they are really playing with colonial desires of the audience. So the audience dresses up in these characters, whatever they want. It's kind of fascinating to see what you choose and to see how you become part of this photograph. So, you know, you will have people firmly asserting real colonial imagery because that's what they really want, or people who really have always wanted to dress up like an Indian, like just their whole life, and now they've been given permission by the artist to do this. But when you get into it, you're also with these two figures who are going to mess with you a little in the photograph. So I think it is a really open way for people to examine their own desires and their own histories of these images and how they've played out in your own body, in your own life, in your own desires that you haven't faced. So it's a really good way to kind of do that. And it's about sex. So we'll talk more about sex in here. So this is Buffalo Boy getting it from 4 directions. These are the 4 directions. And it's interesting because the 4 directions has come to be one of the symbols of indigenous culture, and it's migrating everywhere. Even if people didn't have 4 directions in their indigenous culture, they're now forced to. It's like every institution you go into, it's like, let's put health in the 4 directions. Let's put, anyway, it's a little irritating. Because it's reductive. It can be reductive. But the actual, when you get deep inside what the 4 directions is, it can be a very fruitful thing to base your life and identity and healing on. But here, we've got a target, and you become the target when you look. So you have to kind of be comfortable. It was really sweet the first time we installed it because people were like this. So I think, again, it forced, like the other piece, but this right now, puts you inside the work, and you have to kind of audaciously bend over and look in the glory hole. And Adrian's work has done a lot to forefront two-spirited sexuality and two-spirited teachings and two-spirited ceremony and culture that he comes from. And actually, the Blackfoots have a society, so some of those traditions and teachings are still very strong. Same thing in Anishinaabe. We have different kinds of genders and sexualities that have their own teachings and their own societies that aren't as strong, but are coming back. And I think one of the things with colonization is the absolute X over sex. And one of the things that was so frightening about Indigenous people, and I will say it generally, because all the research I've done, I haven't found one conservative Indigenous nation yet when it comes to sex. So until I find one, until you show me one, I'm going to generalize. And that was the fear. There was such a fear of our freedom around sexuality. The fact that sex wasn't something awful and dirty and to be hidden. And sex also wasn't heterosexual in the sense that it is in the West. For example, in Anishinaabe culture, if you were a woman who was interested in women, nobody gave a shit who you slept with. They just want to know what role you're going to play. So are you going to live as a man or are you going to live as a woman? That's all I need to know. And some people also would choose a kind of asexuality. There were asexuals, who just wanted to be the assistant of the medicine guy, and that's all they wanted. They didn't want to have a relationship. There are all different kinds of sexuality, all different kinds of roles, and all people really cared about is whether you can still do what you need to do to make us survive. So I think that was something very scary. And also the power of our women was very scary to those European men. They did not want white women seeing the kind of power we had, because then they might demand it for themselves. We have more work here by Adrian Stimson, which deals with residential school, and work by Dayna Danger, again, which is asserting a kind of sexuality that is powerful and strong, unapologetic, in your face. And the masks, you can see the masks that they're wearing here, which are all beaded. So bringing these lineages into a contemporary time and in a new way, and in a space that people wouldn't expect. And owning that and honoring that, and they're beautiful too. There's lots to say about all this, but I've gone on way, way, way too long. But Dayna is here, and I wanted to actually not talk about you while you're while you're here. I'd rather just pass the mic to you and give you a chance to say something about your own work.
Yeah, I'll go up. I'll stand in front of my work. Yeah, so what I really want to acknowledge with this work is it is really about community, and it's people that I surround myself with. And so for me, what's really important to acknowledge is the folks that are in the work, and also the folks that helped made this come to be. And usually I do acknowledge that very much in writing and stuff. I didn't do this time, but it's nice that I have this space, because I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it right now. So the masks were, I beaded them, but also two other artists, Nicole Redstar and Trisha Livingston, also helped me bead these. And I paid for their labor out of working, you know, and so and that was really important to me to see, because that's kind of like the really actually like making an economic difference among Native women and doing something that like we love to do, and like why not? So that was really important for me. And so then also these are people that are in my community. Not like, for me, I guess, what I like is the kind of complexity of identity, and you know, whether it isn't necessarily to say that everybody's queer, everybody's this, everybody's that. In these photographs, that's not really kind of like known. It's kind of, it's really, really mysterious in that way, and as it should be, because these aren't necessarily women that you're looking at, or you don't really know who's the top, who's the bottom. There's all these sort of things, and there's a lot of play that's going on, because I am very much referencing BDSM culture, which is very colonial and kind of like white dominated often. And what I wanted to do was mix it up, because for me, what's really interesting is the power, and how in a scene, as they call it, when you're going to negotiate what you want to do with somebody, there's a lot of consent that goes back and forth. This is what I want, this is what I don't want. And I find that this sort of play is also really healing, that people can really like play with like really taboo things, and it's very, and it can be very liberating. Everybody is different. Not everybody is going to be into race play. Not everyone is going to be into rape fantasies. Not everyone is going to be into the switching of dynamics, but you can suspend that reality, at least for a moment, really, where you all of a sudden have a lot of power over somebody, or you can really submit to somebody, or whatever it is. And so I also just like love the idea of just completely being covered in beads, because it's like the texture and just the way that it looks. And I mean, I don't know, a lot of it is about aesthetic. It is about how it looks and like how we present to people. And it's like a signifier, right? Like a lot of these, for the two on the kind of like the bookends that hold it all together, Candace, this is based off of a tattoo that they have, and it was based off of a tattoo that I have, but then they made it Afrocentric, so it's a very specific thing to them. And same with Adrian on the end. And then in the middle, it was more of like a kind of like mysterious sort of play. I asked Lindsay and Sasha to be a part of it, because I really love to see two Indigenous folks. Like I really like share and care and like kind of promote the things that I want to like see in our community, and the complexities of those relationships and all that. So maybe that's not all there. That's my personal sort of like reasons, but that's kind of like the insight that I sort of give to it. But yeah, and also just like to take up as much space as possible, and like, and I want to keep pushing that, you know, that and Indigenous mixed people and just Indigenous people, or like whatever your identification is, like to take up that space and be unapologetic about it, really. So. Miigwech for including me in this awesome show, because there's a lot of amazing people in this work, in this show. It's crazy. So I feel very honored. Yeah, Miigwech.